When John Matthews purchased an abandoned elementary school at a city auction for just $1, his entire life savings depleted after being laid off from his teaching position, he never imagined that the forgotten war bonds locked in the principal's office vault would be worth $180 million, leading to a nationwide search for the families of World War II veterans and ultimately transforming an economically devastated community into a beacon of educational opportunity for generations to come. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The termination letter had arrived on a Thursday afternoon, tucked between utility bills and alumni newsletters as if it wasn't about to demolish John Matthews' entire career. Budget cuts. That cold, impersonal phrase that had become the executioner of so many teaching careers across the district. After 12 years of dedicated service at Lincoln Elementary, pouring his heart into his fourth-grade classroom, developing innovative STEM curriculum that had gained statewide recognition, and mentoring new teachers through their first challenging years, John was simply redundant. We regret to inform you that due to ongoing financial constraints and declining enrollment, your position has been eliminated effective immediately, the letter stated in sterile administrative language. No acknowledgement of the hundreds of students whose lives he had touched. No mention of the teaching awards that lined his classroom walls. Just a clinical severance of professional ties, as if 12 years could be erased with a single administrative decision. John stood in the small kitchen of his modest apartment, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. The timing couldn't have been worse. The economic downturn had hit Millfield particularly hard. The closure of the manufacturing plant that had been the town's primary employer for generations had sent ripples through the entire community. Housing prices had plummeted, businesses were shuttering, and now the school district, once the pride of the county, was hemorrhaging both students and staff. At 45, with a specialization in elementary education and in a market flooded with displaced teachers from consolidating districts, John's prospects felt bleak. His modest savings had already been stretched thin helping his mother with medical bills the previous year. The severance package would cover barely 3 months of expenses if he was extremely frugal. After that, uncertainty loomed like an approaching storm. John made himself a cup of coffee and opened his laptop, pulling up job listings with a creeping sense of dread. The numbers on the screen confirmed his fears. Teaching positions within a 50-mile radius, 0. Administrative roles that might consider his experience, 2, both requiring qualifications he didn't possess. Private schools that weren't facing similar financial constraints, none. The education landscape had changed dramatically in recent years. Budget cuts, policy shifts, increased emphasis on standardized testing rather than creative learning, all had transformed the profession he loved into something nearly unrecognizable. Now, he found himself on the outside looking in, his dedication and experience seemingly worthless in a system prioritizing cost-cutting above all else. Mr. Matthews? A text notification chimed on his phone. It was from Lily Chen, one of his former students who had graduated from his class 5 years ago and still occasionally sent him updates on her academic achievements. I just heard what happened at Lincoln. It's not fair. You're the best teacher in the whole school. Everyone knows that. John smiled despite his situation. Lily had always been precociously perceptive, with a strong sense of justice. She had organized a petition in 4th grade when the cafeteria had tried to remove chocolate milk from the lunch options, and won. Thanks, Lily, he texted back. Sometimes schools have to make tough decisions. I'll be okay. Even as he typed the reassuring words, he wondered if they were true. The following morning, John forced himself to maintain some semblance of routine. Morning jog through the neighborhood, shower, breakfast, and then, the new emptiness of a day without lesson plans, student interactions, faculty meetings, or the 100 small moments that had defined his professional life for over a decade. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To avoid spiraling into despair, John decided to attend the monthly city auction. It was something he'd occasionally done on weekends as a hobby, sometimes finding vintage books for his classroom or educational materials at bargain prices. Today, it would simply be a distraction, a way to fill hours that stretched before him with uncomfortable emptiness. The county courthouse was unusually crowded when John arrived. The economic downturn had resulted in numerous foreclosures and property seizures, creating a buyer's market for those with capital to invest. John felt out of place among the property developers in business attire, clutching leather portfolios and speaking in confident tones about investment opportunities and profit margins. "First time?" asked an older woman with kind eyes who noticed John's discomfort. "No, but it's been a while," John admitted. "I usually just come for small items, books, furniture sometimes." Margaret Holloway, the woman introduced herself, extending her hand. "I've been coming to these auctions for 30 years. Started small, worked my way up to bigger investments. Are you looking for anything in particular today?" "Just browsing," John said, not wanting to admit he was merely seeking distraction from his unemployment. "Keeping my options open." Margaret nodded knowingly. "Sometimes the best opportunities are the ones you don't expect. That's how I got my start, with a property nobody wanted that turned out to be the best investment I ever made." As the auction progressed, John watched as foreclosed homes, commercial properties, and land parcels were sold for fractions of their former values, yet still far beyond his limited means. He was about to leave when the auctioneer announced the next lot. Item 37, the former Westside Elementary School property. 15 classrooms, administrative offices, cafeteria, gymnasium, and library on 5.2 acres. Property condemned in 2018 due to structural issues, sold as is with no warranties. Opening bid, $1. A murmur ran through the crowd. John's attention snapped to the projection screen showing a dilapidated brick building with boarded windows and overgrown grounds. Westside Elementary had closed 3 years earlier when the new consolidated elementary school opened on the other side of town. The building had sat vacant ever since, a silent monument to changing demographics and educational consolidation. The auctioneer continued, "County assessments indicate significant structural issues including foundation problems, extensive water damage, and potential asbestos. Demolition estimates exceed $350,000. All interested parties are advised that remediation costs will be substantial." The room fell silent. Even at $1, the property represented a massive liability rather than an asset. No developer would touch it with the associated demolition and remediation costs. The auctioneer called for bids, but the room remained quiet. John found himself raising his hand, almost involuntarily. $1, he said, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silent room. The auctioneer looked surprised but quickly recovered. "We have $1 from bidder number 29. Do I hear $2? No one responded. Property developers exchanged glances, clearly wondering about John's motivation or whether he understood what he was bidding on. Going once for $1. Going twice. The auctioneer scanned the room one final time. Sold to bidder number 29 for $1. A sense of unreality washed over John as he completed the paperwork. He had just purchased an entire school building, his entire professional life had been spent in schools, and now, ironically, in unemployment, he owned one. The county clerk explained that he would be responsible for all associated costs, taxes, and liabilities. He would need to secure the property and address any immediate safety concerns. Insurance would be his responsibility, as would any incidents occurring on the premises. By noon, John Matthews, unemployed teacher and now owner of a condemned elementary school, was clutching a set of keys and a deed with his name on it. "Congratulations," Margaret Holloway said, finding him in the courthouse hallway afterward. "That was quite an unexpected move." "I'm still not sure what came over me," John admitted, staring at the keys in his hand. "It just felt right, somehow. I've spent my whole career in schools, and now I own one, even if it's falling apart." Margaret studied him thoughtfully. "Sometimes our instincts know better than our rational minds. I started my real estate career with a condemned property nobody wanted. Found out later it had historical significance that made it eligible for restoration grants. Now it's the centerpiece of the historic district downtown. John appreciated her encouragement but knew his situation was different. This isn't a historic building, just a rundown school that nobody wanted to pay to tear down. I've basically volunteered to take on a massive liability. Maybe, Margaret conceded. Or maybe you'll find something there worth more than the building itself. She handed him her business card. I know every contractor, inspector, and municipal official in the county. Call me if you need advice or connections. John thanked her and headed directly to his new property, still trying to process the impulsive decision that had made him a property owner. Westside Elementary School sat at the end of a winding driveway, surrounded by overgrown playing fields and mature oak trees. The two-story brick building had once been the pride of the neighborhood, serving generations of families before enrollment declined and facilities aged beyond economical repair. Approaching the main entrance, John felt an odd mixture of emotions. As a teacher, he had always entered schools through staff entrances, becoming part of their daily rhythm and purpose. Now he was entering as an owner, the sole possessor of a building designed for hundreds of occupants but abandoned to decay. The main doors were secured with heavy chains and padlocks. It took John several attempts to identify the correct key and wrestle with the rusted mechanism before the chains finally gave way. The doors groaned open, releasing the distinctive scent of a long vacant building, musty, damp, with undertones of old books, floor polish, and the indefinable essence of a place where thousands of children had once learned, played, and grown. Sunlight filtered through dirty windows and gaps in the plywood coverings, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like memories trying to reconstitute themselves. The main hallway stretched before him, lined with lockers in the school's colors of green and gold. The floors were institutional tile, cracked and buckling in places where water damage had taken its toll, and the walls were painted cinder block, peeling in large sections to reveal decades of different color choices beneath. John moved slowly down the hallway, using his phone's flashlight to illuminate darker areas. Classrooms branched off on both sides, some still containing broken desks arranged in rows, chalkboards with ghostly erased writing still visible, bulletin boards with faded construction paper remnants clinging stubbornly to their surfaces. It was as if the school had been frozen in time on its last day of operation, with only decay and water damage marking the passing years. The cafeteria was a large open space with industrial kitchen equipment still installed behind a serving counter. The gymnasium featured a wooden basketball court, warped from water damage, with the school mascot, a wolf, barely visible at center court. The library shelves stood empty but intact, built-in and solid, with reading nooks where generations of children had discovered worlds beyond their own. But it was the administrative wing that truly captured John's attention. Unlike the institutional feel of the classrooms, the principal's office and administrative areas had been finished with higher quality materials, wood paneling, better lighting fixtures, solid doors instead of the hollow-core variety used throughout the rest of the building. The principal's office itself was spacious with large windows overlooking what had once been the front approach to the school. As John explored the administrative suite, he realized this area had suffered less damage than the rest of the building. The roof had apparently remained intact here longer than over the classroom wings, protecting the interior from the worst effects of abandonment. In what had once been the principal's private office, John discovered something unexpected, a wall that didn't quite match the others. While 3 walls were finished with the same wood paneling as the rest of the administrative suite, the 4th wall was different, newer drywall that appeared to have been installed well after the original construction. Curious, he examined it more closely and noticed a slight unevenness in the paint, a rectangular outline barely visible under certain angles of light. Pressing his hands against different sections of the wall, John felt a slight give in one area. Further exploration revealed what appeared to be a concealed door, expertly hidden but detectable if you knew to look for it. It took John several minutes of careful investigation to figure out the opening mechanism, a recessed panel that needed to be pressed and slid simultaneously. When the hidden door finally swung open, he found himself looking at a small room about 6 feet square containing filing cabinets and, most surprisingly, a substantial floor safe of the kind typically found in banks or high-security government facilities. The hidden room had no windows and appeared to have been constructed during renovations in the 1970s, based on the materials used and a date stamp on the inside of the door frame. The filing cabinets were locked, as was the safe, but a thorough search of the key rings he'd been given at the auction yielded no keys that fit either. The safe was a serious commercial-grade model with both a combination dial and a key lock, manufactured by Mosler, a company known for creating secure storage for government facilities, banks, and high-value assets. A small brass plate identified it as a model from the 1940s, though it appeared to have been installed in this location much later. John sat back on his heels, staring at his discovery with mounting curiosity. Why would an elementary school principal need a hidden room and a high-security safe? What could possibly have been kept here that required this level of secrecy? As he examined the room more carefully, John noticed a small wooden box that had fallen behind one of the filing cabinets. The box was crafted from polished walnut with brass hinges, approximately the size of a standard textbook. Inside, he found a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age but still intact. The journal belonged to Robert Westington, the school's founding principal from 1944 to 1972. The first entry was dated September 3, 1944, and began, "Today we welcome the first students to Westside Elementary. Many of the children have fathers overseas fighting for our liberty, and it is our sacred duty to ensure their education continues uninterrupted despite the sacrifices their families are making." Subsequent entries documented the school's early years, interspersed with references to the ongoing war effort. Westington had apparently been deeply involved in war bond drives, organizing the school community to support the troops through various fundraising initiatives. The journal entries became increasingly detailed about the bonds being collected, with precise records of denominations, serial numbers, and the names of purchasing families. One entry from June 1945 caught John's attention. "Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt visited our school today to recognize our war bond achievement. With over $50,000 collected from our small community, we have set a record for elementary schools nationwide. The bonds will mature in 30 years, providing a valuable nest egg for the children's futures when they reach adulthood." As John continued reading, the story became clearer and more astonishing. Principal Westington had organized a community-wide initiative where families purchased war bonds in their children's names, to be held in trust until maturity. The safe apparently contained these bonds, intended to be distributed to the original purchasers or their descendants once they reached full value. But as John read further, he discovered that many families had moved away from the area in the post-war economic shifts. Others had lost documentation of their purchases, and some had simply forgotten about the bonds as decades passed. Principal Westington had meticulously tracked all this information, apparently intending to ensure every bond eventually reached its rightful owner. The final journal entry was dated August 15, 1972, the day before Westington's retirement. "The bonds remain secure in the vault, now worth substantially more than their purchase price. My successor has been briefed on their existence and the ongoing responsibility to protect these assets until they can be properly distributed. I have created a comprehensive record of all purchasers, their descendants, and last known locations to facilitate this eventual distribution." John checked his watch and was startled to see that nearly 4 hours had passed since he'd entered the building. The journal in his hands potentially documented the existence of millions of dollars in war bonds, bonds that legally belonged to the families who had purchased them nearly 80 years ago, but which had never been claimed or distributed. If the safe contained what the journal suggested, he had stumbled upon a forgotten cache of wealth that rightfully belonged to the descendants of World War II-era residents, many of whom might still live in the community, unaware of their inheritance. The implications were staggering. John carefully placed the journal back in its box and locked the hidden room, securing the main entrance as he left. His mind raced with questions and possibilities. If the bonds were still in the safe, unclaimed for nearly 8 decades, they would have continued to accrue interest all this time. Their current value could be astronomical, but the challenge of identifying rightful owners after so many decades would be equally substantial. As he drove home, John reflected on the strange twist his life had taken. Yesterday, he had been an unemployed teacher with dwindling savings and uncertain prospects. Today, he was the owner of a condemned school building that potentially contained a fortune in unclaimed war bonds, a fortune that didn't belong to him, but which he now had a responsibility to protect and, somehow, return to its rightful owners. Back in his apartment, John spread out his notes and began researching. War bonds from the 1940s, he learned, had been issued in various denominations from $25 to $10,000, with terms ranging from 10 to 30 years. Many series had continued to accrue interest long after their original maturity dates, particularly if they had never been redeemed. Based on Principal Westington's journal entries about collecting $50,000 in bonds, an enormous sum in 1940s dollars, the current value could potentially be in the millions, depending on the specific series and denominations. But the more pressing question was the combination to the safe. Without it, the entire discovery remained theoretical. John returned to the journal, searching for any clues Westington might have left about accessing the vault. Nothing obvious appeared, but he noticed that certain entries had small numbers written in the margins, seemingly unrelated to the text. Could these be parts of the combination? It seemed unlikely that Westington would have written the actual safe combination in a journal, even one kept hidden, but perhaps he had created a system that would allow his successors to deduce the combination from information contained in the journal. John decided to return to the school the next day with better equipment, proper flashlights, tools, and supplies that would allow for a more thorough exploration. He would need to document everything carefully, possibly involving authorities once he confirmed what was actually in the safe. As he finally prepared for bed, exhausted but mentally energized by the day's discoveries, John reflected on Margaret Holloway's parting words, "Maybe you'll find something there worth more than the building itself." She couldn't have known how prophetic those words would prove to be. The condemned school building he had impulsively purchased for $1 might contain not just historical artifacts, but a forgotten treasure that could transform countless lives, if he could solve the mystery of the safe and trace the families who had invested in America's future during its darkest hours. Tomorrow would begin a journey he never could have anticipated, a journey that would connect him to the community's past, potentially transform its future, and give his own disrupted life a new and unexpected purpose. For the first time since receiving his termination letter, John felt a surge of optimism. Sometimes the end of one path revealed the beginning of another, more meaningful one. The school had lost its original purpose of educating children, but perhaps it could serve a new purpose, connecting generations and fulfilling promises made long ago during a time of national sacrifice. The next morning, John woke with renewed purpose and a plan. After his morning routine, he gathered supplies, flashlights, a digital camera, gloves, basic tools, a notebook, and his laptop. The journal was carefully placed in his messenger bag. Today's mission: document everything thoroughly and attempt to crack the safe combination. As John drove toward Westside Elementary, he noticed details he'd missed the previous day. The neighborhood surrounding the school had clearly suffered from economic decline. Homes that had once been well-maintained middle-class residences now showed signs of neglect, peeling paint, sagging porches, overgrown yards. Yet there were also small signs of resilience: carefully tended flower beds amid the decay, freshly painted front doors, children's toys indicating families still called this area home despite its struggles. The school property itself looked even more forlorn in the morning light. Chain-link fencing, rusted and listing in places, surrounded the grounds. Warning signs declaring condemned structure, no trespassing were posted at regular intervals, their red lettering faded by sun and rain. Nature had begun the slow process of reclamation, with saplings pushing through cracks in the asphalt parking lot and vines climbing the brick exterior. John unlocked the main entrance and made his way directly to the administrative wing, eager to return to the hidden room and its mysteries. As he navigated the dark hallways, the silence felt heavier than the day before, the weight of abandonment more pronounced now that the initial shock of discovery had worn off. Schools were meant to be filled with voices, movement, the organized chaos of learning and growth. The emptiness felt wrong, like a theater without performers or an instrument without music. In the principal's office, John examined the hidden door more carefully in the improved light of his high-powered flashlight. The craftsmanship was impressive. Someone had gone to considerable effort to create a seamless transition between the regular wall and the concealed entrance. It spoke of deliberate secrecy, not just casual privacy. Inside the hidden room, John took methodical photographs of everything: the filing cabinets, the safe, the dimensions of the space itself. He tried each key on his ring with the filing cabinets, but none worked. The safe remained equally impenetrable, its combination dial unmoved by random attempts. Settling cross-legged on the floor, John opened Principal Westington's journal again, searching more deliberately for clues to the safe combination. The margin numbers he'd noticed previously appeared on 7 different pages, each a single 2-digit number: 23, 18, 42, 07, 35, 51, and 29. A standard combination lock would typically use 3 to 5 numbers, so these couldn't all be part of the same sequence. As John studied the entries associated with these numbers, he noticed they all related to significant dates in World War II history: D-Day, Pearl Harbor, VE Day, and so on. Westington had apparently used historical milestones as memory anchors for his record-keeping. Following a hunch, John examined the dates of these entries more closely. June 6, 1944, D-Day, had the number 23 in the margin. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, had 18. May 8, 1945, VE Day, had 42. The pattern wasn't immediately obvious until John realized he needed to look not at the dates themselves, but at their significance to the school's history. Checking the school's founding date mentioned in earlier entries, September 3, 1944, John calculated the number of days between that date and each historical milestone. The numbers didn't match exactly, but they were close enough to suggest a direction. What if the combination was based not on the historical dates themselves, but on their relationship to the school's important milestones? The entry about Eleanor Roosevelt's visit, June 15, 1945, caught his attention again. This had been the culmination of the school's war bond drive, the very achievement that had likely necessitated the safe in the first place. The margin number for this entry was 35. John calculated the number of days between the school's founding and Roosevelt's visit: 285 days. Not a direct match to 35, but what if? He divided 285 by 35. The result, 814, not quite a round number. But what if the calculation was different? What if 35 represented the bond collection's duration? Checking earlier entries, John found the war bond drive had begun exactly 35 weeks before Roosevelt's visit. The other margin numbers began to make sense through similar calculations. Each represented a time period, percentage, or numerical value significant to the bond drive. After 2 hours of cross-referencing entries and calculating possible sequences, John believed he had identified the most likely combination: 35-18-42-07-29. Kneeling before the safe, John carefully turned the dial to each number in sequence. When he reached the final number and tried the handle, there was a moment of resistance followed by the deeply satisfying sound of tumblers falling into place. The heavy door swung open, revealing contents that had remained sealed for decades. Inside were several metal boxes, each labeled with a year spanning from 1944 to 1945. A leather-bound ledger sat atop the boxes. Opening it, John found a meticulously detailed record of every war bond purchased through the school's initiative: purchaser names, student names, bond denominations, serial numbers, and issue dates. The final page contained a handwritten note: "To my successor and those who follow, these bonds represent not merely financial instruments, but the sacrifice and hope of our community during history's darkest hours. Families purchased these in their children's names, entrusting us with their safekeeping until maturity. Many have been claimed, but those remaining represent families who moved away, lost documentation, or perhaps never returned from war. It is our sacred duty to ensure these bonds eventually reach their rightful owners or descendants, however long that may take. The accompanying records should assist in this task." Robert Westington, Principal, 1944 to 1972. With trembling hands, John opened the first metal box. Inside were dozens of paper war bonds in various denominations, each bearing the name of a purchaser and a beneficiary, typically a child who had attended Westside Elementary during the 1940s. The second box contained similar contents, as did the third and fourth. John carefully photographed several bonds, then used his phone to research their current value. Series E war bonds from the 1940s had continued accruing interest for 40 years after issuance, reaching maturity in the 1980s. However, many bonds had never been redeemed and continued to be valid, though they'd stopped earning additional interest after reaching final maturity. Based on the denominations John observed, ranging from $25 to $1,000 face values, and the quantity of bonds remaining in the safe, his conservative estimate placed their current redemption value at approximately $180 million. It was a staggering sum, divided among hundreds of beneficiaries who had no idea of their unclaimed inheritance. The ethical implications were clear and unmistakable. These bonds legally belonged to the named beneficiaries or their heirs. John had no claim to them despite having purchased the building. His responsibility was to secure them and facilitate their return to the rightful owners, a monumental task given the decades that had passed. John carefully replaced the bonds and ledger in the safe, locked it securely, and retreated from the hidden room, making sure the concealed door was properly closed behind him. This discovery required expert assistance and proper legal guidance. Back in his apartment, John contacted Margaret Holloway, the experienced real estate investor who had offered her help. Over coffee at a local diner, he explained his discovery, carefully omitting specific details about the safe's location or the exact value of the bonds. "You've stumbled onto quite a responsibility," Margaret said when he'd finished. Legally, those bonds belong to the named beneficiaries or their heirs, not to the property owner. But tracing people after so many decades won't be easy. "I know," John agreed. "Some families will still be local, but many will have moved away. Others may have no living descendants. I need guidance on the proper way to handle this." Margaret thought for a moment. "You need 3 things: legal advice from someone specializing in unclaimed property, secure storage for the bonds until they can be properly distributed, and a systematic approach to tracing the beneficiaries." She pulled out her phone and scrolled through contacts. "My nephew is an attorney who specializes in estate law. He'd be the perfect person to consult initially. And I know a historian at the community college who might help with tracing families." John nodded gratefully. "I was a teacher, not a detective or lawyer. This is well outside my expertise." "That's why communities matter," Margaret said with a gentle smile. "None of us has all the skills needed for every situation, but together, we usually have what's required." She studied him thoughtfully. "You know, most people who discovered those bonds might have been tempted to keep quiet about it, especially someone facing financial uncertainty like yourself." John shook his head firmly. "That was never an option. Those bonds represent families' investments in their children's futures during wartime. The money belongs to them, not me." Margaret's expression softened. "That integrity is precisely why you're the right person to have found them." The following day, John met with Margaret's nephew, Devin Holloway, a respected attorney specializing in estate law and unclaimed property. In Devin's office, John explained the situation in detail, showing him photographs of the bonds and ledger while keeping their location confidential. "This is extraordinary," Devin said, examining the photos. "War bonds from this era are still redeemable through the Treasury Department. The principal challenge will be identifying and verifying legitimate heirs after so much time has passed." "What's the legal process for handling something like this?" John asked. "We'll need to establish a formal discovery process," Devin explained. "First, we secure the bonds in a proper financial institution vault. Then we file appropriate notices with state unclaimed property offices and the Treasury Department. Simultaneously, we begin the process of tracing beneficiaries through public records, genealogical research, and community outreach." "What about the school building itself?" John asked. "It's condemned, and I don't have the resources to secure it properly long-term." Devin considered this. the building and the bonds are separate legal issues. The bonds are personal property that happens to be located within the real property you purchased. Your ownership of the building doesn't give you ownership of the bonds, but it does give you certain responsibilities as their finder. They discussed various approaches, ultimately agreeing on a plan that would protect both the bonds and John's interests while prioritizing the identification of rightful owners. Devin would handle the legal aspects, while John would work with Dr. Eleanor Pierce, the community college historian Margaret had recommended, to begin the process of tracing families. One more thing, Devin said as their meeting concluded. This discovery is likely to generate significant public interest once it becomes known. We should develop a communication strategy before proceeding. John nodded, understanding the implications. I don't want this to become a media circus. These bonds represent family legacies, not entertainment. Agreed, Devin said. But strategic publicity could actually help us locate beneficiaries. People who might not otherwise come forward might recognize family names if they see them in the right context. The next day, John met Dr. Eleanor Pierce at the community college library. In her early 60s with silver-streaked hair and penetrating eyes behind stylish glasses, Dr. Pierce had dedicated her career to documenting the region's history, with particular focus on the World War II era and its impact on local communities. Margaret explained your extraordinary discovery, she said after introductions. I've studied Westside's war bond drive in my research on home front initiatives. Principal Westington was featured in several newspaper articles for his exceptional success in mobilizing community support for the war effort. John showed her his photographs and notes, explaining the challenge of tracing beneficiaries after so many decades. We have resources that can help, Dr. Pierce assured him. The college archives contain local newspapers from that period, city directories, school yearbooks, and other records that can establish family connections. Census data can help track population movements after the war. And genealogical databases have become remarkably comprehensive in recent years. How do we begin? John asked. We start with the names in the ledger, Dr. Pierce explained. We'll create a database tracking each bond, its purchaser, the named beneficiary, and what we know about the family. Then we'll begin systematic research to trace these individuals forward in time, identifying descendants who might be legitimate heirs. John realized the scale of the project. This could take months, even years. Yes, Dr. Pierce acknowledged, but we have advantages our predecessors lacked. Digital archives, online genealogical resources, social media connections, tools that can compress what once would have been decades of research into a much shorter time frame. As they began organizing their approach, Dr. Pierce shared stories from her research about the community during wartime, the sacrifices, the uncertainty, the way ordinary people had mobilized to support national objectives. The war bond drives had been about more than money, they represented a tangible way for civilians to contribute to the war effort while simultaneously planning for post-war recovery. These bonds were acts of faith, she explained. Faith that there would be a future worth investing in, that children would have opportunities their parents couldn't imagine, that sacrifice today would yield prosperity tomorrow. John found himself deeply moved by this perspective. And now, decades later, we have the opportunity to fulfill that faith, to complete the circle between those who sacrificed during wartime and their descendants who never knew what was waiting for them. Over the next 2 weeks, a small team formed around the project. Devin handled legal paperwork and established a formal process for verifying and distributing claims. Dr. Pierce coordinated research efforts, recruiting several of her most promising students to assist with the painstaking work of tracing families through historical records. Margaret leveraged her extensive community connections to arrange for secure storage of the bonds at First National Bank, where the branch manager, a former student of John's, was happy to provide a secure vault and discretion. John found himself at the center of these efforts, coordinating between legal, historical, and financial aspects while continuing to explore the school building for any additional records that might assist their search. His teaching background proved unexpectedly valuable, his skills in organizing information, breaking complex projects into manageable tasks, and explaining complicated concepts in accessible terms helped keep the project moving forward. 3 weeks after discovering the bonds, with appropriate legal frameworks in place and initial research well underway, they held a carefully planned press conference. Devon had crafted a statement that explained the discovery while emphasizing the methodical, legally sound process they had established for identifying legitimate heirs. "We estimate approximately 300 families may have unclaimed bonds from this initiative," John explained to the assembled journalists. Some bonds were for as little as $25 face value, others for as much as $1,000, substantial sums in 1940s dollars. Their current redemption value varies based on series and denomination, but all represent legitimate financial assets belonging to the named beneficiaries or their legal heirs. The story captured immediate attention, spreading from local outlets to regional and then national news. By the following day, the West Side Bonds story had gone viral, with headlines emphasizing both the substantial financial implications and the poignant human aspect, wartime sacrifices finally bearing fruit for unsuspecting descendants generations later. The publicity brought an immediate response. Within days, hundreds of emails and calls flooded the dedicated contact channels they had established. Some were from legitimate descendants who recognized family names from published examples. Others came from opportunists making dubious claims. The verification process Devon had designed proved essential in distinguishing between them. For John, the most rewarding aspect was meeting actual descendants as they began the verification process. Martha Simmons, an 85-year-old woman who had attended Westside Elementary during the bond drive, arrived with trembling hands and faded photographs. Her father, a factory worker who had been ineligible for military service due to a childhood injury, had purchased bonds for each of his 3 children as his contribution to the war effort. "Dad always said he did his part by keeping the factories running and buying bonds," Martha explained, tears glistening in her eyes. "He never mentioned the bonds were in our names. All these years, we thought they'd been redeemed long ago. To discover his sacrifice is still waiting for us after all this time, it's like receiving a message from the past." Similar stories emerged as more families came forward, grandchildren discovering their grandparents' foresight, elderly siblings reunited by the process of claiming their parents' investment, great-grandchildren learning about ancestors they'd never known through the tangible evidence of bonds purchased in family names during humanity's darkest hour. Each story reinforced John's conviction that he had made the right decision in bringing the bonds to light and establishing a transparent process for their return. The money itself was significant, life-changing for many recipients, but the connections to family history and previously unknown acts of sacrifice often seemed to mean even more. As summer progressed, the project expanded beyond bond distribution. Dr. Pierce's team began documenting the stories that emerged, creating an oral history archive that captured not just the financial aspects but the human experiences connected to the bonds. John found himself increasingly involved in this aspect, his teacher's instinct recognizing the educational value of preserving these narratives for future generations. The condemned school building itself remained a challenge. While the bonds had been removed to secure storage, the structure continued to deteriorate. City inspectors warned that portions of the roof might collapse before winter, and the cost of securing the building properly exceeded John's limited resources. Yet even this problem eventually yielded to community ingenuity. As the bond story spread, local interest in Westside Elementary's history grew. A grassroots preservation committee formed, seeking grants and donations to stabilize the structure until a permanent solution could be found. Their efforts gained unexpected traction when several national news features highlighted the building's role in the unfolding human interest story. 6 weeks after discovering the bonds, with the distribution process well established and the first families receiving their long-delayed inheritances, John finally addressed his own uncertain future. His savings had dwindled to almost nothing, and while the bond project had provided purpose, it hadn't solved his employment situation. "You should consider monetizing your role in this," Margaret suggested during one of their regular strategy meetings. "Book deals, speaking engagements, there's significant interest in your story." John shook his head. "That feels wrong somehow. I didn't do anything except purchase an abandoned building and follow the ethical path when I found something that didn't belong to me. That ethical path isn't as common as you might think, Devin pointed out. And your story resonates precisely because it represents values people wish were more prevalent: integrity, responsibility, commitment to community good over personal gain. Before John could respond, his phone chimed with an email notification. Opening it, he found a message from the superintendent of a neighboring school district. Mr. Matthews, your work with the West Side Bonds Project has demonstrated extraordinary commitment to educational values and community service. Our district has recently received funding for a new position, Director of Community Integrated Learning, focused on connecting classroom education with real-world community engagement. Your background in education combined with your recent project leadership makes you uniquely qualified. Would you be interested in discussing this opportunity? John stared at the message, a complex mixture of emotions washing over him. From unemployment to unexpected property owner to bond discovery coordinator, and now a potential return to education in a role that hadn't existed when he lost his teaching position, life had taken him on a journey he never could have anticipated when he'd impulsively raised his hand at the county auction. "Everything all right?" Margaret asked, noting his expression. "Yes," John said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I think it just might be." The position of Director of Community Integrated Learning turned out to be a perfect fit for John's unique combination of skills and experiences. The interview process moved quickly, and within 2 weeks, he found himself with a new office at the district's administrative building, a salary that exceeded his previous teaching position, and a mandate to develop innovative programs connecting classroom learning with real-world community engagement. "We were planning this position before your bond discovery made headlines," explained Superintendent Valerie Reyes during his orientation, "but watching how you managed that project convinced us you were exactly the right person. You intuitively understood the educational value in connecting historical documents with living community members, creating learning opportunities that transcended traditional boundaries." John's first weeks in the new role were a whirlwind of meetings with principals, teachers, community organizations, and business leaders. He developed a framework for students to engage with local issues through project-based learning, service initiatives, and mentorship programs. His experience with the Bond Project informed every aspect of his approach. He had witnessed firsthand how powerful intergenerational connections could be when rooted in meaningful shared history. Meanwhile, the West Side Bonds Project continued to gain momentum. Dr. Pierce's research team had successfully traced over half of the bond beneficiaries, with new identifications occurring weekly. Devin had streamlined the verification and distribution process, creating templates that made each subsequent case more efficient to process. The story remained in the public consciousness, occasionally receiving renewed attention when particularly poignant family reunifications occurred. One such case involved the Nakamura family, who had purchased bonds for their 3 children shortly before being sent to internment camps in 1942. The family had never returned to Millfield after the war, relocating to Chicago where they rebuilt their lives. The bonds, forgotten in the trauma of displacement, remained unclaimed for nearly 8 decades until Devin's team located the youngest Nakamura child, now an 85-year-old grandmother of 7 living in Detroit. "My parents never spoke about what they lost," Keiko Nakamura explained when she visited Millfield to claim her family's bonds. "They focused only on building a new future for us." To discover they had secured this investment for us, even as they faced such uncertainty, it helps me understand their strength in ways I never fully appreciated before. Stories like Keiko's reinforced the project's significance beyond mere financial transactions. The bonds had become threads connecting past to present, illuminating forgotten acts of courage and foresight that deserved recognition. Each successful distribution closed a historical loop, fulfilling promises made during history's darkest hours. 3 months into his new position, John was approached by Margaret Holloway with an unexpected proposal. The grassroots committee working to preserve West Side Elementary had gained surprising traction, securing several preservation grants and private donations. However, they still lacked a comprehensive vision for the building's future use. "We've stabilized the structure and prevented further deterioration," Margaret explained during a Saturday meeting at her office. The roof has been patched, the most dangerous structural issues addressed. But without a sustainable purpose, we're just delaying the inevitable. What are you suggesting? John asked, sensing she had something specific in mind. The committee believes the building could be repurposed as a community education center, Margaret said, sliding a folder across the table. A place for adult education classes, after-school programs, community workshops, historical exhibits, including a permanent display about the Bond discovery. But we need someone to develop this vision into a practical implementation plan. John opened the folder, finding preliminary architectural assessments, budgetary projections, and letters of support from community organizations. This is an ambitious undertaking. Yes, Margaret agreed. And uniquely aligned with your new professional role. The committee would like to contract with the school district for your services in developing this concept. Superintendent Reyes has already expressed preliminary interest, pending your agreement. The proposal was elegant in its symmetry. The abandoned school that had unexpectedly transformed John's career trajectory would itself be transformed into a new educational asset for the community, one that honored its historical significance while serving contemporary needs. I'd need to ensure there's no conflict of interest given my ownership of the property, John said thoughtfully. Devin has already examined that angle, Margaret assured him. Since you purchased the property for nominal value and haven't financially benefited from it, there's a clear path forward. The committee proposes purchasing the property from you for the same dollar amount, then transferring ownership to a community trust established specifically for this purpose. Over the following weeks, John divided his time between developing district-wide community learning initiatives and crafting a vision for the Westside Community Education Center. The two roles complemented each other perfectly, lessons from each informing the other, creating a synergy that yielded innovative approaches to both challenges. 6 months after discovering the bonds, with autumn painting the trees surrounding Westside Elementary in vibrant shades of gold and crimson, John stood on the building's front steps watching a remarkable scene unfold. Community volunteers of all ages were clearing overgrown landscaping, repairing walkways, and preparing exterior surfaces for fresh paint. Among them were several bond beneficiaries and their families, connecting with the building that had unexpectedly preserved their family legacies. It's coming back to life, observed Dr. Pierce, joining John on the steps. Just like the community itself. She wasn't exaggerating. The bond distributions, now totaling over $120 million to 217 families, had injected unexpected capital into the region. While some recipients lived elsewhere, a significant portion were local, and many had chosen to reinvest portions of their windfall in the community. New businesses had opened, existing ones had expanded, and housing renovations were visible throughout once neglected neighborhoods. The economic impact extended beyond direct spending. The story had generated positive national attention, attracting visitors curious about the Bond School and its community. Several former residents had returned after learning of their connections to the area through the Bond Project's outreach efforts. The community college had developed a certificate program in historical preservation and archival management, inspired by Dr. Pierce's work on the Bond Project and now enrolling its first cohort of students. Did you ever imagine your impulsive $1 purchase would catalyze all this? Dr. Pierce asked. John shook his head, still amazed by the chain of events. I was just trying to find a purpose after losing my teaching position. I never dreamed I'd stumble into something with such far-reaching impact. That's how meaningful change often happens, Dr. Pierce observed. Not through grand designs but through individuals making principled choices when unexpected opportunities arise. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a sleek black car that parked at the curb. A woman in her early 60s emerged, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, surveying the activity with evident interest. That's Senator Victoria Chen, Dr. Pierce whispered. What's she doing here? Senator Chen approached the steps where they stood, extending her hand. Dr. Pierce, Mr. Matthews, I hope I'm not interrupting. I'm Victoria Chen. We know who you are, Senator, John replied, shaking her hand. What brings you to our humble renovation project? Your not-so-humble community revitalization story, she corrected with a warm smile. I've been following the West Side Bonds project since it first made headlines. The Senate Banking Committee is developing legislation addressing unclaimed financial assets, particularly war bonds, savings bonds, and similar instruments that may be forgotten or unknown to rightful owners. Your experience here provides a compelling case study in both the challenges and potential benefits of addressing this issue systematically. Are you suggesting similar situations might exist elsewhere? Dr. Pierce asked. Treasury Department analysts estimate approximately $29 billion in unredeemed savings bonds are currently outstanding nationwide, the senator explained. Many have matured but remain unclaimed, often because beneficiaries are unaware of their existence. Your project has demonstrated both the logistical challenges in reconnecting these assets with rightful owners and the profound community benefits when it's done successfully. John felt a familiar stirring of possibility. What exactly are you proposing, Senator? I'd like to invite you both to testify before the committee next month, she said. Your first-hand experience could help shape legislation creating a more accessible, proactive system for identifying and notifying potential beneficiaries of unclaimed federal financial instruments. The West Side model, combining historical research, community engagement, and transparent distribution processes, offers valuable lessons that could be applied nationally. The invitation represented an opportunity to amplify the impact of their work far beyond Millfield's borders. What had begun as one unemployed teacher's desperate dollar bid at a county auction might ultimately influence national policy affecting billions in unclaimed assets and countless families across America. That evening, John walked alone through the quiet hallways of West Side Elementary, reflecting on the building's journey from abandoned relic to symbol of community renewal. The classrooms that had once educated generations of children would soon serve new educational purposes. The administrative wing where he discovered the hidden room would become a historical exhibit preserving the story of the war bonds and the community's wartime contributions. In the principal's office, now clear of debris and partially renovated, John studied the concealed door to the hidden room, now permanently exposed as part of the planned historical exhibit. The safe had been relocated to the local historical society, its contents thoroughly documented and mostly distributed, though a few bonds remained unclaimed pending ongoing genealogical research. You seem contemplative, Margaret observed, finding him there. Second thoughts about transferring ownership to the trust? Not at all, John assured her. Just appreciating the journey. A year ago, I was desperate and directionless, devastated by losing a career I loved. Now I have a more impactful role than I ever imagined possible. The building's journey mirrors yours, Margaret noted. From abandoned and apparently worthless to being recognized for hidden potential and renewed purpose. John nodded, seeing the parallel. There's a lesson in that, isn't there? Value isn't always obvious or immediately apparent. Sometimes it takes someone willing to look deeper, to take a chance on something others have discarded. That applies to buildings, bonds, and people, Margaret agreed. The tragedy is how much potential remains undiscovered because no one takes that chance. The conversation lingered with John as he prepared for his testimony before the Senate committee the following month. Working with Dr. Pierce and Devon, he developed a presentation that balanced personal narrative with substantive analysis of their process, challenges, and outcomes. They compiled key statistics, case studies highlighting particularly significant distributions, and recommendations for streamlining similar efforts nationally. On a crisp November morning, John found himself seated before the Senate Banking Committee, adjusting the microphone as cameras captured the proceedings for C-SPAN and various news outlets. The committee room's formality, with its polished wood, official seals, and senators arrayed behind the elevated dais, contrasted sharply with the dusty abandoned school where their journey had begun. Mr. Matthews, began Senator Chen, chairing the proceedings, please share with the committee how you came to discover these forgotten war bonds and the approach you developed for identifying and verifying rightful claimants. John took a deep breath and began his testimony, describing his unexpected career transition, the impulsive purchase of the abandoned school, and the discovery that had transformed not only his life but an entire community. As he spoke, he noticed senators of both parties leaning forward with genuine interest, the human elements of the story transcending typical partisan divides. What began as a personal crisis became an opportunity to reconnect generations, fulfill forgotten promises, and catalyze community renewal, John explained. The bonds themselves held significant financial value, approximately $180 million in total, but their impact extended far beyond monetary worth. They represented intergenerational commitments made during wartime, tangible expressions of faith in America's future. Dr. Pierce followed with expert testimony on the historical context and research methodologies they had employed. Devin explained the legal frameworks they had developed for verification and distribution. Together, they painted a comprehensive picture of a community-based approach that had succeeded where bureaucratic processes might have faltered. During the question period, Senator Martinez from Arizona leaned into his microphone. "Mr. Matthews, you purchased this property for $1, discovered assets worth $180 million, and immediately set about returning them to their rightful owners. Many people might have been tempted to remain quiet about such a discovery. What motivated your decision to make this public and undertake such an extensive effort to distribute the bonds?" John considered the question carefully. "Senator, I spent 12 years teaching fourth graders about citizenship, responsibility, and integrity. Those aren't just abstract concepts for classroom discussion, they're principles that guide real decisions in challenging situations. The bonds never belonged to me, they were entrusted to the school by families making sacrifices during wartime. My responsibility was clear from the moment I understood what I'd found." "And yet," pressed Senator Williams from Ohio, "you received no financial benefit from this discovery? No finder's fee or compensation for your substantial time investment?" "The compensation came in forms more valuable than money," John replied. "I witnessed families discovering unknown chapters of their histories. I saw a struggling community recognize its own resilience and capacity for renewal. I found a new professional direction that allows me to create meaningful learning experiences connecting generations. Those outcomes are worth far more than any percentage I might have claimed from the bonds." The testimony extended for nearly 3 hours, covering every aspect of their experience and its implications for potential legislation. As the session concluded, Senator Chin thanked them for their contributions and announced that their recommendations would substantially inform the Unclaimed Assets Reconnection Act being drafted for introduction in the next legislative session. Afterward, in the hallway outside the committee room, several senators approached to continue the conversation informally. Senator Garcia from New Mexico pulled John aside. "My father was a World War II veteran who spoke often about buying bonds for my sister and me. Hearing your story made me wonder if there might be unclaimed bonds in our family history as well." "That's precisely the awareness this legislation hopes to create," John noted. "Millions of Americans may have similar connections they've never explored." As they prepared to leave the Capitol, Dr. Pierce received an unexpected phone call from her research assistant in Millfield. "We've identified another bond family," she explained to John after ending the call. "The Jensen family. They purchased 12 bonds for their twin daughters in 1945, then relocated to Oregon when the father received a job offer in the timber industry. Both daughters are deceased, but we've located 5 grandchildren, all unaware of their potential inheritance. Will you handle the notification process as usual?" John asked. Dr. Pierce hesitated. "Actually, I thought you might want to make this particular notification personally. The family history research revealed something interesting. One of the Jensen grandchildren is currently a 4th grade teacher at Lincoln Elementary." John felt a chill of recognition. "Lincoln, that's where I taught before being laid off." "Yes," Dr. Pierce confirmed. "Emily Jensen Thompson began teaching there 3 years ago. According to our records, she took over a classroom just down the hall from yours." The synchronicity was remarkable, a direct line connecting the wartime sacrifice of a family purchasing bonds for their children's future to a granddaughter who had unwittingly followed in John's professional footsteps at the very school where his teaching career had ended. The circle of connection tightened further, revealing patterns of meaning beneath seemingly random events. 2 days later, back in Millfield, John sat across from Emily Thompson in a quiet corner of a local cafe. At 32, with warm eyes and an energetic presence, she embodied the passionate dedication of an early career teacher still in love with her profession. "I was surprised to receive your call," she admitted after introductions. "We never really worked together at Lincoln, though I certainly knew who you were. Everyone spoke highly of your teaching." "I appreciate that," John said, then carefully explained the purpose of their meeting, the bond discovery, the identification process, and the Jensen family connection that had led to her. Emily listened with widening eyes, occasionally shaking her head in disbelief. "My grandparents on my mother's side," she clarified. "The ones who moved from Millfield to Oregon during the war?" "That's correct," John confirmed. "Your grandfather Harold Jensen purchased 12 Series E war bonds between 1944 and 1945, 6 in each of his daughters' names, including your mother, Catherine. Based on the denominations and applicable interest, their current redemption value totals approximately $68,000. This is..." Emily struggled for words. "Completely unexpected. Mom never mentioned war bonds. I don't think she knew about them. Many families didn't discuss these purchases," John explained. "They were seen as patriotic duties during wartime, not necessarily as significant financial assets to be tracked across generations." Emily stared into her coffee cup, processing the information. "The timing of this is almost eerie," she finally said. "The district just announced another round of budget cuts last week. My position is secure for now, but programs are being eliminated, resources stretched thinner. I've been buying supplies for my students out of my own pocket, trying to maintain quality experiences despite the constraints." She looked up, meeting John's eyes. "And now this inheritance appears from grandparents I barely remember, connected to the very community where I'm teaching." "The bonds often seem to arrive at meaningful moments," John observed. "We've seen that pattern repeatedly throughout this project." "What would you do?" Emily asked suddenly. "If you were in my position, receiving this unexpected inheritance with a direct connection to education and community legacy?" John considered carefully before answering. "I can't answer that for you. But I've observed that many recipients find the most satisfaction when they honor the original spirit of the bonds, investments in future generations made during a time of national sacrifice." 2 weeks later, John received an invitation to attend a special announcement at Lincoln Elementary. Curious, he arrived to find the gymnasium decorated for an assembly, with district officials, school board members, and local media in attendance. Principal Sandra Williams welcomed everyone, then introduced Emily Thompson. Stepping to the microphone, Emily explained her recent discovery of her family's war bonds and their connection to Millfield's history. "My grandparents invested in the future during wartime, purchasing bonds for their daughters that would mature years later. That legacy recently returned to me in an unexpected inheritance, a gift across generations." She paused, surveying the assembled students and staff. "After careful consideration, I've decided to honor that intergenerational commitment by establishing the Jensen-Thompson Educational Innovation Fund with this inheritance. This endowment will provide annual grants for teachers developing creative approaches to community-integrated learning, ensuring that budget constraints never prevent meaningful educational experiences for Lincoln Elementary students." The announcement drew enthusiastic applause, particularly from teachers who had been struggling with limited resources. District officials expressed gratitude for this unexpected support during challenging financial times. But it was the knowing smile exchanged between Emily and John that captured the essence of the moment, recognition that what had begun as crisis and loss could transform into opportunity and renewal when viewed through the lens of intergenerational commitment. As the assembly concluded, Superintendent Reyes approached John. "Your influence extends in unexpected directions," she observed. "This endowment aligns perfectly with the community integration framework you've been developing for the district." "I can't take credit for Emily's decision," John demurred. "She found her own way to honor her family's legacy." "Perhaps," the superintendent acknowledged. "But the ripples from your initial discovery continue to spread in remarkable patterns. One person making principled choices can set extraordinary changes in motion." John reflected on the journey from unemployment to unexpected purpose, from an impulsive $1 auction bid to community transformation, from personal crisis to renewed meaning. What had appeared to be an ending, the termination of his teaching career, had actually been the beginning of a more expansive chapter, connecting him to his community and its history in ways he never could have anticipated. The abandoned school building that had seemed worthless to developers had contained not just monetary treasure but historical connections that reverberated through generations. Similarly, his own career transition, painful as it had initially been, had revealed capacities and opportunities beyond what his classroom teaching had encompassed. Value wasn't always visible on the surface. Sometimes it lay hidden behind concealed doors, inside forgotten safes, or within apparent endings that actually contained the seeds of new beginnings. The wisdom lay in remaining open to unexpected discoveries, responding to them with integrity, and recognizing the patterns of connection that wove individual stories into the larger fabric of community and history. 1 year after the discovery of the war bonds, the Westside Community Education Center opened its doors with a ribbon-cutting ceremony attended by hundreds of community members. The once condemned building had undergone a remarkable transformation, with strategic renovations preserving its historical character while adapting spaces for contemporary educational needs. The administrative wing, including the hidden room and safe location, had been meticulously restored as a permanent exhibit documenting the bond discovery and the community's wartime contributions. John stood at the podium, looking out at the assembled crowd, families of bond recipients, local officials, volunteers who had contributed to the renovation, students from area schools, and media representatives covering what had become a nationally recognized story of community renewal. When I purchased this building for $1, I was an unemployed teacher searching for purpose, John began. What I discovered behind these walls was more than financial treasure, it was evidence of a community's faith in the future during history's darkest hours. The bonds represented promises made across generations, promises we've had the privilege of fulfilling together. The center embodied that intergenerational connection in its design and programming. Classrooms that had once educated children now hosted adult education courses, senior digital literacy programs, vocational training, and youth enrichment activities. The renovated library served as a research center where visitors could explore historical records and genealogical resources, often discovering their own connections to the community's past. The gymnasium had been transformed into a multi-purpose community gathering space for everything from town halls to cultural celebrations. Most significantly, the center housed the newly established Millfield Institute for Community Renewal, an organization dedicated to researching, documenting, and replicating successful approaches to community revitalization. Funded initially by a coalition of foundation grants attracted by the Bond Story's national profile, the Institute had already begun working with 3 other economically challenged communities to identify their own hidden assets and potential catalysts for renewal. Today marks not an ending but a continuation, John explained to the audience. The story that began with war bonds purchased during global conflict now extends into a future these original investors could never have imagined, yet one they helped make possible through their faith in what was to come. Following the ceremony, John led several guided tours through the center, including the historical exhibit documenting the bond discovery. The hidden room had been preserved exactly as he'd found it, with the safe door permanently open to reveal its empty interior, a visual reminder of assets once concealed now distributed to their rightful owners and circulating throughout the community. "How many bonds remain unclaimed?" asked a visitor during one tour, a history teacher from a neighboring district who had brought several students to the opening. 28 bonds from 14 families, John replied. Dr. Pierce's research team continues tracing these remaining beneficiaries, though some cases present significant challenges, families that moved overseas after the war, name changes through multiple marriages, instances where entire family lines have ended. For these, we've established a community trust that will utilize any ultimately unclaimed funds for educational initiatives aligned with the original spirit of the bonds. As the day's formal activities concluded, John found a quiet moment to visit his favorite space in the renovated building, a second-floor classroom overlooking the newly landscaped grounds. This room had been adapted as a teacher resource center where educators could develop innovative curriculum connecting classroom learning with community engagement. "Found your sanctuary, I see," observed Superintendent Reyes, joining him at the window. John smiled, acknowledging the accuracy of her observation. "This room reminds me why all of this matters. Education isn't just about transferring information, it's about connecting generations, preserving community knowledge, and preparing students to build on what came before. Your work has exemplified that philosophy," she noted. "The community integration framework you've developed has already transformed how our district approaches education. 6 other districts have requested our model, and the state education department has expressed interest in scaling it further." The superintendent's words highlighted another unexpected outcome of John's journey, his professional transformation from classroom teacher to educational innovator with influence extending far beyond his previous role. The crisis that had seemed devastating a year earlier had actually opened pathways to greater impact than he could have achieved remaining in his 4th-grade classroom. Life rarely follows the paths we envision for ourselves, John reflected. Sometimes the most significant opportunities emerge from what initially appear to be devastating setbacks. A perspective worth sharing with students, the superintendent agreed. They need to understand that resilience isn't just about enduring difficulties, it's about remaining open to unexpected possibilities within apparent endings. That evening, a smaller gathering convened in the center's community room, the core team that had guided the bond project from discovery to completion. Dr. Pierce and her research assistants, Devin and his legal colleagues, Margaret, and several key community volunteers shared a celebratory dinner, marking both the center's opening and a significant milestone in the bond distribution process. "Our latest distribution brings the total to 283 families," Dr. Pierce announced, updating the tracking board they had maintained throughout the project. $174. 3 million returned to rightful owners across 38 states and 7 countries. Each representing a promise fulfilled, Margaret added. Promises made during wartime by ordinary people who believed in a future they might never see themselves. The conversation flowed easily among people who had become more than colleagues through their shared mission, discussing memorable bond recipient stories, reflecting on challenges overcome, and contemplating lessons learned that might benefit other communities facing similar economic struggles. As dessert was served, Dr. Pierce tapped her glass for attention. "Before we continue celebrating, there's one final piece of business regarding the bond project." She nodded to Devin, who distributed folders to everyone at the table. "What's this?" John asked, opening his folder to find legal documents he didn't recognize. "The resolution of the final mystery," Dr. Pierce explained. "You've all wondered about the ultimate fate of Principal Westington after his retirement in 1972. Despite our extensive research, we found no trace of him after he left Millfield, no death certificate, no subsequent address, no family connections." She paused, allowing the significance of this gap to register. Throughout their research, this absence had been a persistent puzzle. How could someone so meticulous about record-keeping disappear so completely from historical records? 2 weeks ago, while digitizing school board minutes from the 1970s, my assistant discovered a previously overlooked document, minutes from a closed executive session discussing Principal Westington's retirement arrangements. It referenced a special compensation agreement in recognition of extraordinary services to the district and community. Devin continued the explanation. "This led us to county property records, where we discovered Robert Westington had received ownership of a small parcel of undeveloped land as part of his retirement package, land that appeared worthless at the time, located well outside town in what was then remote forest." "The airport expansion," Margaret said suddenly, making the connection. "That area was purchased for the regional airport development in the 1990s. "Exactly," Devin confirmed. "The county acquired numerous parcels for that project, including one still legally owned by Robert Westington, who could not be located at that time. Following proper procedure for unclaimed property, the county established an escrow account for the fair market value of the land, $1.8 million, which has been accruing interest for nearly 30 years. John stared at the documents in his folder, which detailed the history of this transaction and the current status of the escrow account, now valued at approximately $4.2 million. With no identified heirs and the statutory waiting period long expired, Devin continued, these funds were about to revert to the county general fund. However, given our bond project's public profile, county officials approached us to explore alternatives that might better honor Westington's legacy. Dr. Pierce smiled. The final documents in your folders represent the establishment of the Westington Legacy Foundation, a permanent endowment that will support the Community Education Center's operations and programming in perpetuity. The county commissioners approved this resolution unanimously yesterday. The announcement represented perfect symmetry. The principal who had safeguarded community bonds for decades would now, through this unexpected legacy, continue supporting community education far into the future. What had begun with John's desperate $1 purchase had completed a circle connecting past sacrifice to future opportunity. The following morning, John arrived early at the center, drawn by a desire to experience the renovated building in solitude before it filled with the day's scheduled activities. Walking through quiet hallways that would soon buzz with learning and connection, he reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had transformed both the building and his own life. In the exhibit room, he paused before a wall displaying photographs of bond recipients, elderly men and women holding certificates documenting their reclaimed inheritances, middle-aged children accepting on behalf of deceased parents, grandchildren discovering previously unknown legacies from grandparents they barely remembered. Each face told a story of intergenerational connection, of promises kept across decades. "I thought I might find you here," said a familiar voice. Margaret Holloway entered the room, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Couldn't stay away on opening day?" John accepted the offered coffee gratefully. "Just wanted a quiet moment to appreciate how far we've come." From unemployment to founding director of a nationally recognized community renewal institute, Margaret observed. "Quite a journey for 1 year." "I still can't quite believe it sometimes," John admitted. "So many coincidences had to align, my job loss happening just before the auction, my impulsive bid on a building no one else wanted, finding that hidden room and safe." "I don't believe in coincidences of that magnitude," Margaret said thoughtfully. "Sometimes the universe puts the right person in exactly the right place at precisely the right moment. You were uniquely qualified to understand the significance of what you found and to honor it appropriately." Before John could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of a tour group, high school students participating in a community history project. Their teacher, recognizing John, asked if he would share the discovery story directly with the students. For the next hour, John guided the students through the exhibit, describing his initial purchase of the building, the discovery of the hidden room, and the complex process of tracing bond families across generations. The students' questions revealed genuine engagement with both the historical aspects and the contemporary implications for their own community. "What would have happened if someone else had purchased the building?" asked one particularly thoughtful student. "Someone who might have kept the bonds for themselves or simply destroyed records they didn't understand?" "That's a profound question," John acknowledged. "The bonds legally belong to the named beneficiaries regardless of who discovered them, but without someone committed to tracing those rightful owners, they might never have been claimed." It highlights how consequential seemingly small decisions can be, not just for ourselves but for entire communities. As the students continued to the next portion of their tour, John reflected on the ripple effects that had spread from his initial discovery. The most visible impacts were economic, injecting $174 million into beneficiary families, creating jobs through the center's renovation and operations, attracting tourism and positive attention to a previously struggling community. But the less tangible effects were equally significant. The project had strengthened community bonds through shared purpose and achievement. It had connected younger generations to their historical roots, helping them understand the sacrifices and foresight of those who came before. Perhaps most importantly, it had demonstrated that communities possessed hidden resources and resilience that could be activated through collaborative effort and shared vision. That afternoon, John participated in a panel discussion featuring bond recipients sharing how the unexpected inheritances had impacted their lives. The stories varied widely: a retired teacher who had established a scholarship fund, a middle-aged couple who had used their inheritance to finally open the small business they'd dreamed about for years, a young parent who had secured stable housing for her family after years of precarious renting. Martha Simmons, now 86, described how her bond inheritance had enabled her to digitize and publish her father's wartime journals, creating a historical resource now used in classrooms throughout the region. Dad purchased those bonds as his contribution to the war effort, never expecting personal recognition, she explained. Now his words are teaching young people about sacrifice, duty, and hope during difficult times. Keiko Nakamura shared how her family's bond discovery had prompted her to research her parents' internment camp experience, a painful history they had rarely discussed. The bonds represented their enduring faith in America despite the injustice they experienced, she said, her voice steady but emotional. Learning about this investment they made for us while facing such uncertainty has transformed my understanding of their courage. As John listened to these testimonials, he recognized that the bonds' true value transcended their monetary worth. They had become vehicles for healing historical wounds, bridging generational divides, and illuminating forgotten chapters of family histories. Each story represented not just financial inheritance but the transmission of values across time, sacrifice, foresight, commitment to future generations. The day's final event was a community dialogue about lessons from the Bond Project that might inform future initiatives. Seated in a circle in the renovated gymnasium, community members of diverse ages, backgrounds, and perspectives shared their reflections on what the experience had revealed about their collective capacity for renewal. We've learned that our greatest resources aren't always visible on balance sheets, observed the mayor. Sometimes they're locked away in forgotten rooms or buried in historical connections waiting to be rediscovered. And that progress doesn't always mean abandoning the past, added a local business owner. Sometimes it means finding new relevance in what came before, adapting historical assets to serve contemporary needs. A high school student offered her perspective. I always thought history was just about memorizing dates and facts. This project showed me how history actually connects to real people's lives, how decisions made decades ago still impact us today. As the dialogue continued, John noticed a woman at the edge of the circle who hadn't spoken, elderly, elegantly dressed, observing the proceedings with evident interest but remaining silent. When the formal discussion concluded and participants began breaking into smaller conversations, she approached him directly. "Mr. Matthews," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Eleanor Westington Davis. Robert Westington was my father." John's surprise must have been evident, because she smiled gently. "Yes, after all your searching, it turns out I've been here all along, living just 2 counties away. I've been following your remarkable work through news reports but wanted to see the completion in person. We searched extensively for your father's relatives," John explained, still processing this unexpected development. "County records showed no children, and we found no marriage certificate." Eleanor nodded. "Dad was intensely private about his personal life, especially after my mother died when I was young. I was raised primarily by my maternal grandparents in another state, using my mother's maiden name after her death, a complicated arrangement that effectively disconnected our public records. You know about the foundation established with your father's unclaimed property compensation?" John asked. "Yes, and I fully support that decision," she assured him. "Dad dedicated his life to education and community service. This center and foundation perfectly honor that legacy." She opened her handbag and removed a small leather-bound notebook. "I brought something that might interest your historical collection. Dad's personal diary from the war years, including his initial conception of the Bond Initiative and his correspondence with Eleanor Roosevelt that led to her visit." John accepted the notebook reverently, recognizing its historical significance. "This is an extraordinary addition to our archives. Would you be willing to share your memories of your father for our oral history project?" "That's why I'm here," Eleanor confirmed. "Some stories deserve to be preserved, especially when they demonstrate how ordinary people can make extraordinary differences across generations." As they walked toward the center's recording studio, Eleanor paused before the wall of Bond recipient photographs. "Dad would be deeply moved by what you've accomplished, not just returning the bonds but creating this place of connection and renewal. He believed education extended far beyond classroom walls and formal schooling. This center embodies that philosophy perfectly. Your father's foresight made all of this possible, John acknowledged. He created the systems that preserved these assets for decades, ensuring they would eventually reach their intended beneficiaries. Eleanor smiled. And you provided the final link in that chain, the person who recognized the significance of what he'd found and committed to honoring its purpose rather than exploiting it for personal gain. Their conversation was interrupted by an announcement that the center would be closing to the public in 30 minutes. As community members began departing, John found himself drawn back to the principal's office, the space where his journey had begun with the discovery of the hidden room and safe. The office had been restored to its 1940s appearance based on historical photographs, complete with period-appropriate furnishings, a portrait of President Roosevelt, and war bond posters decorating the walls. The hidden room door remained permanently open, integrated into the historical exhibit. Standing in this space, John reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had transformed his life and an entire community. What had initially appeared to be catastrophic career disruption had actually been the first step toward greater purpose and impact. The abandoned school building that developers had dismissed as worthless had contained treasures far more valuable than mere property, connections between generations, tangible evidence of faith in the future, seeds of community renewal waiting for the right moment to germinate. The metaphor wasn't lost on John. Communities, like individuals, contained hidden potential that might remain undiscovered without someone willing to look beyond surface appearances, to invest time and effort in exploring forgotten spaces, to recognize value where others saw only liability. Sometimes the most significant opportunities emerged from what appeared to be abandoned possibilities. As John prepared to lock the building for the evening, he paused at the main entrance, looking back at the transformed interior. The hallways that had once echoed with children's voices would now resonate with different but equally important sounds, adult learners acquiring new skills, seniors sharing wisdom with younger generations, community members collaborating on shared challenges, researchers documenting pathways to renewal that might benefit other struggling regions. The building had found new purpose without abandoning its essential nature as a place of learning and connection. Similarly, John had discovered new avenues for his educational passion without abandoning the core values that had drawn him to teaching initially. What appeared to be endings, a terminated teaching career, an abandoned school, had actually been doorways to unexpected beginnings. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, expanding the center's programming, developing the Institute's research agenda, continuing the search for remaining bond families, applying lessons from the West Side experience to other community renewal efforts. But tonight, in the quiet of the completed center, John simply appreciated the journey that had led to this moment, a journey that had begun with loss but transformed into discovery, connection, and renewal. $1 had purchased not just an abandoned building but a pathway to purpose that extended far beyond what he could have imagined when raising his hand at that fateful auction. The war bonds had represented faith in a future the purchasers might never see themselves, and in fulfilling those long-delayed promises, John and his community had discovered their own capacity for renewal and connection across time. As he turned out the lights and secured the main entrance, John thought about all the abandoned schools, buildings, and communities across America, places dismissed as worthless by conventional economic metrics but potentially containing their own hidden treasures waiting for someone with vision to recognize their value. The lesson of West Side wasn't just about unclaimed bonds. It was about unclaimed potential existing in overlooked places and seemingly discarded possibilities. His final act before leaving was to place Eleanor Westington's donated diary in the center's secure archive room. Tomorrow it would begin the careful process of digitization and preservation, ensuring that Robert Westington's vision and legacy would be accessible to future generations, another thread connecting past to present to future in the ongoing tapestry of community renewal. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.